Hello, I'm David Taylor. I'm an undergraduate at the University of Washington, Tacoma, and I will be giving a brief overview on accessibility in video games and a look into the current climate of video game accessibility. So, video game accessibility is being more widely accepted by the video game industry. Video games are much more accessible than they were even 10 years ago. I find a good place to start for this topic is the 2009 Able Gamers video that was posted on YouTube asking developers, have you ever thought about how disabled people play games?
Actually.
Yes, because I have disabilities.
That never came up in any conversation. No.
Oh yeah.
Not really.
Only I played a video game a few years back, which was for blind people.
Have I ever? Actually, I have. I haven't given it a lot of thought, but I have.
Yes, I have actually. I think they're very important to deal with any part of the industry.
I think this is a really good example, a look kind of into the past where accessibility is sort of an afterthought. People don't really give it there's not really a nuanced look at video game accessibility. However, we will see that this changes. But first, we must address what is accessibility. Accessibility is the idea that people are not excluded from something on the basis of experiencing a disability. People can do what they need to do in a similar amount of time and effort as someone that does not have a disability. If a subset of people cannot use a product or service, it is a good indication that the product/service is poorly designed or implemented. And so you can see that accessibility is a wide array of things that occur in everyday life, from subtitles to really well-designed websites to even the curb cuts that you see in sidewalks. Which brings up the term curb cut effect, which is the idea that some measures taken for disabled people have positive outcomes for other groups. It turns out that when you design with disabled people in mind, oftentimes it's just a better design in general. So what is video game accessibility? Well, software can be developed in such a way that it can benefit people with visual, hearing, physical, cognitive, and neurological disabilities. There has been a recent shift in the video game industry to create video games in such a way that all people can play and enjoy games. However, there is still a divide on what games disabled gamers can play. For example, the game Last of Us 2 has 60 accessibility options with text-to-speech, fully remappable controls, and high contrast mode. However, a game by a similarly sized AAA studio, Deathloop, has been criticized for its cursor-based menus, lack of button remapping, small text sizes, hard-to-read fonts, and inability to customize UI indicators. So there's this idea of designing an accessible video game. And is this a need to have or a nice to have? How can smaller creators address accessibility? Do they even have the money and time to address accessibility with smaller budgets and smaller teams? And now we've reached the section of the good ones, the all-around great picks. These video games are not only just accessible, but they're also great games to play. Games like The Last of Us Part 2, Celeste, God of War, Gears 5. And so I'll go through a few of these great games and some of the accessibility options and how they address disabled gamers. The first up is Red Dead Redemption 2, which has really great subtitles. Subtitles in games like Red Dead Redemption 2 are accommodating to gamers who are hard of hearing. However, it's not as easy as it seems. It's not as simple as putting text on a screen. You must account for readable text. Unlike games like Cyberpunk 2077, it's important that gamers are allowed to change the size and opacity. There needs to be subtitles for more than just dialogue. Maybe even background sounds need to be addressed in subtitles. And as you can see in Red Dead Redemption 2, wow, it's just a great font. It even has this sort of painted black background. It just looks really nice and it's really clear to see. Next up is Hades, which is also another great game. And Hades is able to implement auto-aim and remappable buttons. Auto-aim and remapping makes the controls of video games accessible for gamers with movement impairments. I agree with able gamers on the concept that video games should not be allowed to be released without players being able to modify most of their input settings. Games like Hades on the Nintendo Switch are in sharp contrast to first-party Nintendo games such as The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. This is because Nintendo often takes the stance that their games are designed/polished to be played with a certain controller a certain way. However, this limits gamers. Remappable controllers, such as the Xbox Adaptive Controller, are much better for gamers with physical impairments. They're more modular, and they can be remapped. Overwatch is also a great example of a game that's accessible. Overwatch has a colorblind mode. There are a lot of different visual ways to express video games, such as colorblind mode and high contrast mode. And these help gamers who are visually impaired. Color blindness is a spectrum of different types of colors that cannot be seen and should be accounted for. This has been really well implemented in games such as Overwatch and Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War. Another feature that makes video games accessible are video game tutorials that explain game mechanics. Some players cannot retain or recall what to do in a game or how to use its interfaces. And so developers should create games such as The Witcher 3, which can bring up helpful info about interfaces and mechanics on the fly, so that players can review and refresh their knowledge. And I think the shining example of accessibility in gaming is probably Celeste. Not only is Celeste one of the best platformers, it is also one of the most accessible, with assist modes that can modify game speed, stamina, and health. Some gamers have physical impairments such as less feeling in their hand, reduced reaction time, or maybe less dexterity and need a modified game that can help them play. And now we get to the section, the bad ones. Not the most accessible video games. In this section, these video games are not very accessible and they do not get their own dedicated slides. So first up is Rainbow Six Extraction. This game suffers from small, unintuitive icons, confusing menu structure, and unintelligible menu narration voice. It also forces players to use all buttons and stick clicks when remapping to play the game. It's been rated a 5 out of 10 for accessibility on the website caniplaythat.com. Death Stranding suffers from no controller remapping, extensive trigger holds, precise multi-button route plotting, and features that make the game more accessible are progress locked. The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword HD, one of Nintendo's IPs, doesn't do very much when it comes to accessibility, and ports often do not get any meaningful accessibility when they are ported into newer consoles. In this game, players cannot view the control scheme without multiple steps, They can't change the dialogue speed, and there's no mini-map waypoints or wayfinding assistance. And lastly, From Software games such as Sekiro are notoriously lacking in accessibility options, especially when it comes to their brutal difficulty. They trade accessibility for what they call creative vision. Many disabled gamers just straight up cannot interact with this game. And so we get to our final section, addressing the haters. People who choose less accessibility. It's actually very surprising, but the internet is split on topics such as, should Sekiro have an easy mode? It's really 50-50. Gamers sometimes want to just keep the game they've always enjoyed, sometimes at a loss to gamers with disabilities. The gaming community is very against change, especially when it comes to beloved franchises such as Dark Souls. This section includes arguments against accessibility and counter-arguments. It's really interesting to look into accessibility, and I really recommend reading more about it on Polygon.com. But let's just jump into it. And so here's the creator of Dark Souls. He's notoriously against adding different difficulty levels. He likes players to have a very difficult game, maybe even if they can't even play it. So this sort of idea of standardized difficulty, even though people's abilities might be a spectrum. So there's lots of debate, especially in this Kotaku article. 2,000 comments. This video has like 800,000 views. It's sort of against accessibility in video games. So let's look at some of the ideas that are brought up. It's even interesting that I was bringing up this sort of discussion in our ethics class. And I was surprised that an overwhelming amount of people were against this sort of easy mode option in From Software games. But let's see if these arguments or counter-arguments might change their mind. People on the internet might say making a game accessible makes it too easy. However, some gamers can't even play a game because of how it's designed. If other players are abusing these options, it either doesn't matter in single-player games like Dark Souls, or these players are morally bankrupt, especially if you're playing in multiplayer. Everyone should be able to interact with these games. They should be able to come to the table and play them. Another point people bring up is accessibility sacrifices the director's vision. However, games should have visions that are more than difficulty. It's reductionist to say a game like Sekiro, which is this pseudo-fantastic feudal Japanese action game with tense, aggressive combat, into it just needs to be protected as this press buttons fast at the right time game. Like, it's so much more. It has a story to tell, more than just brutal gameplay. Another point people bring up is that accessibility costs a game lots of time and money. However, accessibility has been done really well with indie developers such as the creator of Celeste. Usually, game accessibility is simple, such as swapping a palette or giving more controller mappings. These features could bring in more customers who are disabled. About 15 to 20% of gamers are disabled. And the last point is that some people bring up the idea that not all games are for all people. This is sort of heartbreaking because I know just personally my life has just been made so much better by the video games I've been able to play, how they've made me feel, how they've inspired me. And I think that everyone should be able to play them. You know? In conclusion, I think the community, especially with their wallets, should encourage more games to be accessible, because it's really just great for everyone. And that wraps up my presentation on accessibility in gaming. I have a lot of good links that I think you guys should check out, such as these really well written Polygon articles about accessibility, some of these opinion pieces on what makes a game accessible, some examples of games and their accessibility, and why accessibility matters. I have the link to the Able Gamers video. Able Gamers is a charity that works towards making video games more accessible. And I also have a link to caniplaythat.com, which gives really great reviews for gamers with hearing and vision impairments. Thanks for listening.